Welcome back to another episode of Profitless on Purpose, the accounting podcast for nonprofits, and not just from one accountant's perspective. I'm one of your hosts, AJ Wheeler, but also from two other very esteemed and well-versed accountants, Mark Palardy.
Hey, everyone.
And Lisa Sheldon.
Good evening.
We have a great show for you. We have a couple articles to get through, and then we're going to talk about grants. So, Mark, I think you're first up with our first article, huh?
You bet. So this article comes from a gentleman named Bill McKendry, and the article is called A Nonprofit's Guide to Problem Solving. Be more painkiller, less vitamin. And I thought this was interesting. It's in these COVID times that we're living through, this article is kind of focused on nonprofits needing to find ways to be more efficient and more impactful, and spending fewer resources on messaging that doesn't resonate with the core audience that you're trying to reach. And the article kind of talks about how many nonprofits in normal working times will kind of be what he calls a vitamin, or be, sweets, where you're just kind of trickling out information and you're saying, please contribute to us because we're good for you, we're good for the community. And his position that he posits is that you need to be more impactful, more painkiller, more, need-based in this kind of climate to get the attention and to get yourself funded. So if you're a performing arts center, you talk about how your doors might close if you don't get some people to buy some gift cards or something up front. There are other examples about why you have an urgent need, and how you might miss the opportunity to if they don't donate or help fund you now. So I'm curious what you guys think about this. It seems like an interesting tactic, but I'm concerned that it doesn't work for very long, that you sort of get into a cry wolf situation. And I'm curious if you guys have similar thoughts.
Well, I think the part of the article I think that resonates, and I think that really kind of is what I would point to as like the main thing I took out of the article was be aware of the times. And what I took from this was, and I'll use an example here. I work with a nonprofit that's in the mental health space, and one of their large like fundraisers that they do is a conference that they bring together for training on how to provide mental health services. And with the pandemic, and this is quite a big conference that they put a lot of time and effort into, and the pandemic put a big monkey wrench into that. And so they were kind of, scrambling to figure out how they were going to do this. And part of this is like a huge ask from, not only sponsors, speakers, and stuff like that. So what they decided to do was, and they were agile about it, and they were able to move to a virtual conference. What that did was, and what was kind of like hindsight being 2020 on this, was it cut out the physical space rental, it cut out travel fees and per diem for speakers, and actually they had more participation because people with any kind of disabilities or anything were able to access it much easier. So they actually ended up, and they're actually thinking about going forward and holding these virtually. And so I think kind of when I was reading this, I kind of like be aware of the times, thinking about, if a nonprofit's agile and has the ability to like pivot quicker, a lot of times I find they're kind of like stuck in the old way, like, oh my gosh, it's COVID. How are we going to have our annual fundraising gala? We'll just send out a postcard and ask for money. Did you think about, having a virtual event, with the technology that's out there and especially available for nonprofits for either little or no money from big companies? I think there's a lot of advantage there. But I think you're right, Mark. Just crying wolf and saying, oh my gosh, we're going to close our doors, please donate, can get old really quick if you're not providing some kind of substance behind what you're offering. And I think that goes true in and out of a pandemic. If you're a nonprofit that's essentially just, licking by, I guess essentially begging for donations, you're not going to make it as far as somebody that's offering something of substance that you can hold up and show results for.
Yeah, AJ, I agree with that. I think that the crying wolf is where, is kind of what it sounds like to me. You're going to continue to cry wolf through all of this. And at some point, people are going to say, you know what, I've heard you cry wolf 16 times, but I don't know what you're doing, right? I haven't seen results. I haven't seen the programs that you're putting on, and I don't know what purpose you're serving. And so there's no value add there for someone to want to donate to in a situation like that. Now, obviously, you may hit those folks that are really avid supporters of whatever your not-for-profit is. So if you're a not-for-profit performing arts center and someone really loves the performing arts that you're providing, and you say, if we don't raise money, we're going to have to shut our doors, you may get some of your donors that are going to give. But I don't know that you're going to reach out to a whole lot of other people by using that. Right. So let me show you what we're able to do for you and what we're able to provide for you in a way that's meaningful to them. And I mean, from a personal experience or from personal thought, I want to know what they're doing. I want to know how, if I'm donating my money to somebody, I want to know what they're doing. Not, if you don't give me money, I'm going to shut my door.
Yeah, and I think another problem you run into is that if you have a global situation like we currently have, and every nonprofit is out there doing this, then you just have this chorus of screaming at you saying, we desperately need your money. And then you still have to make the decision as to who you're going to, donate to. It's just laced with a little more guilt. So, AJ, you got another article for us?
Absolutely. So this one comes our way of actually a blog called Stanford Social Innovation Review, whatever that means. But I thought it was a good article, Leading Boards in a Virtual World. So this kind of really hit home. It talks about it kind of lays out how to engage board members, when you're not allowed to meet in person. And the article talked about kind of two schools here. Somebody that gets on a board and is very busy and they're doing it for all the best intentions, but usually couldn't make the board meetings because they were at an awkward time or they had to drive across town or whatever that may be. Now they're seeing more participation because these boards are doing it virtually. The other part is that they talked about was, with all the technical difficulties and trying to, it's a much different engagement when you're in a Zoom call board meeting than if you're in person and somebody's presenting to you. You have the social time beforehand, snacks, board presentation, and you go through the whole rigmarole. So they kind of give ways to build boards effectiveness virtually. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about this, but I think it goes beyond just board meetings via Zoom calls, but I'll get your guys' take. Connect members to the mission. So they're talking about like really driving home what the nonprofit is doing and connecting those board members to what that is. Recruit members who found it hard to attend meetings in person, like having a virtual option allows, like we discussed, allowed somebody that, cuts out at 5:30 or 6 to be able to make a 6:15 board meeting from their work because they just need to connect, via Zoom. Onboard new members virtually. There's another one, like we all, a year into the pandemic, we forget how much travel time it took to get from place A to place B. And if you're onboarding somebody, that's additional time that staff or board president or an executive director needs to stick around to onboard a new board member. So doing it virtually might cut out, the middleman, so to speak, in transportation wise. Schedule shorter, more frequent meetings was one that they offered. We might get some discussion about that, whether or not that's efficient or not. Reconsider meeting times, maybe have the option for shorter meetings, less commute, and in some cases, more flexible work schedules, facilitate attendance for members that may not have been available at other times. Minimize reporting and maximize discussion. So we might have some comments about this because I think we've all been in a board meeting where it can drive off into discussion land over the littlest thing. But what it says is essentially making virtual meetings engaging requires careful choreographing. So using an advanced board packet to efficiently convey important information and sticking to an agenda. Make sure everybody gets a chance to speak. I think this is a big one. There's often the introvert or the person in the group that is kind of meek, but often they have something very good to say, and making sure that they have a place and a platform to be able to say something and not just have to interject, or feel like they're grinding everybody else to a halt. And then make the most, there's just three more here. Make the most of the virtual tools to boost participation. Kind of self-explanatory. Take charge when conflict erupts. You need somebody in charge, like leading the meeting. Give people a chance to get to know each other personally every meeting. So they're talking about saving time before or after for everybody to kind of meet and greet. Use board work outside meetings to build connections. Organize social events outside of meetings to foster relationships. And the last one, make it a team effort. So, often it's the executive director and usually the board president that are charged with leading and managing and setting up a board meeting. And they're saying to try and delegate that and make it less of a chore for everybody at the top, and kind of spread the pain around for everybody getting ready for the meeting. But I'd like your guys' take and kind of if they've missed anything or maybe if they're off base with any of those suggestions. I mean, we've all been in our share of board meetings.
I think that the suggestions that they're making are really good. One of the things that I found really interesting was they were talking about being able to expand your board to people that maybe not in your geographical area. So, some of these bigger not-for-profit organizations that may have limited their board members to people that were local could now expand to members outside of their state, outside of their, even their region in the country. To allow those people to have some input into the board. And I think that's a really good idea. I do think that, there is that definite need, especially if you're newer to a board, to have that social interaction and to make sure that you are able to meet and understand and know these board members. And as we all know from our Zoom meeting, our year of Zoom meetings, you really can't read body language on a Zoom meeting. So it's really important for these board members to kind of know each other a little bit before they start getting on these calls, because things could be taken the wrong way. Somebody could say something and be very, might be sarcastic. And if you don't know them, you might take something the wrong way. But I think that you get the Zoom burnout, but you do have to focus on how do you get the most out of those meetings. Love the board packet idea. I've worked at organizations where the board packet was always done and sent out a week before the board meeting. So the board had a time to actually digest it. Then they can come back with questions, comments specific to something they've looked at, as opposed to just getting the packet when they walk in the meeting, right? And now I'm trying to read the packet and have a conversation about it, and I haven't had time to really focus on it. I think there are a lot of good suggestions in there, and I think that trying to work through all of this, through this last year has really proven to just be a learning platform for everybody, right? We're all learning new ways to communicate, new ways to get to work together. But I do think that the suggestions make a lot of sense, and I think that it would be great if we actually had boards that would take that advice. Mark.
Yeah, I'm going to echo a lot of what you both have been saying, because I do think there are some really good ideas in here. Necessity is the mother of invention. And frankly, boards, along with everybody else, didn't have a whole lot of time to plan for the changing landscape that we've had to face in the last year. And I think, being able to bring in different voices virtually is a benefit. But, anecdotally, I sit on a board where I'm the treasurer and I get to deliver those financials at every board meeting. And man, it's rough. It's rough when you're trying to present financials that you've handed out ahead of time, that people have had a chance to review, and most of them didn't even look at them. And then you're trying to just, express numbers and explain trends and talk about variances. And in a room, like Lisa was saying, you can see body language and you can see who's engaged and who's not, and you can back up. And on Zoom, you have the wandering eyeballs and you can't tell if somebody's camera is over there or if they're looking off to the side because they're on a web page and they could give a rat's ass about what your financials actually say. So as the treasurer, it's your job to present the information and to help ensure the solvency, I should say, of a nonprofit. But at the same time, it's rough when you're not connected with people in a room and don't have that social aspect, like AJ was talking about, where you can connect ahead of time and have a few snacks and, talk about what's going on outside of life. So I think making the conscious effort to institute some of these ideas, and we're going to have a link down in the show notes with this article. So, and honestly, we'd really like some of your feedback on some of the techniques that are mentioned here that you think, as an audience listener, which we know is out there, and you're our vast audience listener. Just comment on our YouTube link as to which ones you think might be off the mark, or which ones you think are really good ideas, and maybe some that you've implemented that aren't on this list.
Actually, I have a couple bullet point, talking about financial presentations. I think nothing can derail a board meeting quicker than a deep dive into a miscellaneous expense line or questions regarding variances or something like that, because you're going to lose a lot of the audience. A lot of the audience won't have a financial background. So it's really prudent on the person presenting those financials, keep it simple, stupid, as condensed and to still convey the same story, but as condensed and as easy for everybody to read as possible. And I often suggest then you connect those financials with results of operations, meaning they're like taking like a service organization, connecting those financial results to like how many people were served, how close are we meeting to our grant goals and our budgets. I think conveying that in a very easy sense, like we're 75% there and we're 75% through the fiscal year, we're on track. I think those things matter much more than reading line by line the results of a P&L and a balance sheet. And then my last suggestion is make sure you have a subcommittee, at the very least a finance subcommittee, where all the nitty gritty details can be worked out. I think in before a general board meeting where 3/4 of the people, their eyes are going to glaze over. Looks like they've had 2 drinks, and you can definitely see that body language. So, but that's just my 2 cents. Lisa, do you have our last article ready?
I do. So the last article comes from the Nonprofit Times, and it's called "Grants: Why 1 + 1 Must Equal 2." I mean, aside from math, it really goes into. It's a short article, but it really goes into the fact that when you're applying for grants, or when you're looking at grants, or you're reporting on grants, you really need to focus on what you're doing at an organizational level or a regional level, while providing information on homelessness. We know homelessness across the country is a big issue, but you can't use numbers that relate to the entire country when you're going out to apply for a grant, when you're doing a grant proposal. You got to use local numbers, right? You got to understand what's going on in your local climate. Your area may or may not have a huge problem and may not have a need. And so if you've got an organization that you're going to for grant funding, you really got to be able to provide them data and real data trends that relate to the problems in your area that you're asking for the funding for. The other point that the article brings up is really looking at, if you got stuff on your website from 2018, you got to update that. You got to be current in what you're putting out there. You can't be looking at data that's 2-3 years old and expecting to find grantors who are going to go, yeah, that's great. Okay, well, you know what? I need to know what happened last year, or I need to know what happened in the last quarter. So, and that's really where the article was pointing. And I thought it was kind of interesting just to make sure that people, most of us are aware of that, but let's really focus on how we manage that and how we report that out when we're using those numbers. Paige, Mark, comments?
Well, I think when I read this, I totally agree. I think you really need to back up what the need is and what your reach is going to be with hard data. Now, the question that follows that is, where do you find this hard data? Because often these numbers are like difficult. So I have a few suggestions. Your local, like community college or local state college, usually has a department that works in the kind of area that you're trying to serve, and they would have presumably free or very low cost to a nonprofit information that would support your grant writing efforts. And you might even be able to have them be a partner on the grant if it's something that you can collaborate with. The other portion is using other nonprofits. So if you're, in a larger city, you might have a regional nonprofit that does work and teaming up with them to be able to get information from them on what they serve, or like a kind of complementary service. So you think about like senior health and maybe like a senior meals organization being able to team up together to realize numbers of reach, you know what I mean? Or at least a target demographic of what you're looking at. So I think, yes, you need the information, but I think there needs to be then like the other portion of that is being able to find that, quantify it, and put it into a grant proposal. So yeah, that's the hard part, I guess. Like it makes sense to need the information and give them accurate local kind of demographics or like target audience for this kind of stuff, but then where to find it. And I think that's the difficult part. And many times if you're in an obscure kind of, or not obscure, but if you're in a very niche kind of avenue, you're going to have to pay for the information, and that information can be costly. So you need to think about that when you're writing the grant and when you're proposing it. But oftentimes you can get a lot farther as a nonprofit with partnering or asking for upfront data to be able to write the grant and then loop them in on the back end of being a partner on a grant. Follow your procurement policies, but having them in the pocket, so to say, to work with them later to then deliver them more data on that data set, I think is intriguing and often a very viable solution.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think everything you said is correct, AJ, and I think in large part this article is correct, but I think you also have to take into account what your nonprofit does, right? Because if you're not a hyperlocal nonprofit, let's say you're a nonprofit for some rare disease where you don't have hyperlocal data, you might not, there may be, 1,000 cases worldwide. So you might have to go beyond the scope of what your local information is going to give you, because fundraising on the 2 people in your local community who might have this disease might not actually get you the grant funding and the stuff that you need. But some of the pieces when you go too global and you go too worldwide, like Lisa was mentioning, is that the data can be real out of date, because how frequently are these things updated and how frequently are gigantic studies being done? So I think it's a fine line you have to walk, and each nonprofit has to kind of look at that and maybe try things a little differently if there are others in your sector that are also going for the same kind of funds. Just try different approaches and try different ways of getting the funds and see what works for you, because ultimately that's what's going to fund the bottom line, is the processes that work.
I think it really highlights, Mark, the fact that these nonprofits need to keep track on people served, results of operations, and then to Lisa's point, making sure that information is available to the general public on your website, on your reports, on your annual report, to drive home what you're doing, how you did it, and the number and people affected by it. So Mark, you got our discussion point for this week?
You bet. We're going to roll into our discussion this week on a favorite topic of nonprofits, and that's grants. Not talking Ulysses S., not talking Cary Grant, not talking even Richard E. Grant for some of you fans of British cinema. What we're talking about are nonprofit grants, right? So a nonprofit grant is a fundraising grant. It's a financial donation given to an organization. Like, the obvious benefit of this is that they're giving you money, but it's not a loan, right? The money is yours to keep. So there's lots of different types of grants that you can get. There's governmental grants. There are reimbursing grants where you spend the money up front and then you have to provide receipts and you get reimbursed by the grantor. These can come from foundations. These can come from individuals. Oftentimes grants have restricted strings attached, if you will. So they're restricted money. So here's a grant that you can use for this project that you're working on, for this, if you're a museum, for this exhibit that you're putting up, if you're a mental health organization, for this program to, serve this individual. So I wanted to kind of open up the discussion and do our roundtable on maybe the different kinds of grants, how you apply for grants, some ideas, and then I have some numbers that I can throw at this as to some statistics about grants as well. But let me throw it to either one of you for your talking points.
Well, I'll start. I mean, as you started to talk a little bit about government grants, and when you talk about government grants, generally many of them are coming from the state or from the federal government, and some of them are passed through the state and then through the city. So you really need to take a good look at your organization before you start to look at federal grants. There are requirements around federal grants. There are strict requirements. And if you spend over $750,000 a year of federal grant money, you're going to be required to have a federal single audit, which is going to cost you more money because there's more work to do. And some of the requirements around your accounting systems and the way you buy things and are going to be a little stricter. There's going to need to be more controls around what you do. So as with any grant, there's going to be strings attached, and you are going to have to do your grant reporting at the end. But federal grants on a large scale, if you're in that range, in that sweet spot where you're getting $500,000 a year and you're, under the radar right now, and you're thinking of going out for a bigger federal grant, you need to consider those other things because they are going to cost you some more money on the back end, with audit fees, with probably hiring more people. And so that is an issue that I think comes up with federal grants. You've got your other things. You talked a little bit, Mark, about reimbursement type grants. When you consider reimbursement type grants, you need to consider how long you can hold off without getting your money, right? You're providing programs and services, and monthly or quarterly, you're submitting a grant report, asking for reimbursements for all this money that you've spent. And then you got to wait to get the money. So you got to consider those kinds of things and look at your cash flow to determine whether or not you're going to be able to afford to take on that reimbursement grant. So it sounds great that you're going to get grant money, but sometimes there are issues that, you might want to consider and say, you know what, we're going to pass on that one because we're not going to be able to manage that. AJ, what are your thoughts?
My thought goes directly to when, I guess, assessing a grant. So in my head, there's a flow chart when you're reading through a grant, and you and the first T in the road you need to come to is whether it's restricted or unrestricted, right? And the best world is if it's unrestricted, collect the cash, put it away, and pay everybody, that's meant to fund your organization. And those are very hard to get because usually they're for admin, and everybody wants an unrestricted grant. So wish in one hand, but those are usually few and far between. But if you can get one, that's great. And essentially, I don't want to say free money, but it's there to fund your admin essentially. Or usually what I've seen unrestricted grants for are hiring a new development director, and then and then presenting how you're going to make that sustainable after that grant goes away, or hiring a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. And then the finish up of that grant is show them how that's going to be self-sustaining. How are you going to be able to fund that position after the grant is gone? The other side of that equation then is a restricted grant. And from there, you need to break it down even further. Is it a fee for service? Because you need to determine how the accounting treatment of that grant is going to happen. Is it fee for service? Is it, a milestone kind of restricted grant where you get money as you meet milestones, after so many participants served? Time-wise, you get the rest of the money. And all that has different accounting treatment that you need to be aware of. And then there's the rare occasion where you get paid up front because an organization is lazy on their payables and just pays you, 2 or 3 years worth of funding for something that you already do. And that is the rare occasion where actually a nonprofit has deferred revenue. They're paid up front for a contract for something that in no way they're not, say your Meals on Wheels, right? And you get a grant to serve 1,000 seniors meals. Well, you're serving 20,000 meals a week, in your community. There's no way you're not going to make that 1,000 meals, in the next 3 months, but you haven't served them yet. So it is really deferred until you're able to deliver those services and show that you've delivered those, 1,000 meals. Now it's probably the week after you get the money, but it's a rare occasion where actually there is deferred revenue in a nonprofit. So And then the last thing to think of is if you're getting sponsorships or grants around an event. And then in that case, that would also be a deferred revenue piece, because if the event doesn't happen, you have to give the money back. So, it's a rare occasion. But Mark, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you bring up, both of you bring up great points. And again, I'm going to jump back to an anecdote, because with the entire COVID thing and the PPP loans that came out, the government was also handing out EIDL loans / grants, and they were kind of unclear as to whether they were grants, whether they were loans. But the paperwork initially said that these are grants that are given to nonprofits and these will be forgiven. And then come to find at the end of the day, back in November, a local nonprofit I was working with then got a bill that this grant was actually a loan, even though the paperwork never stated that it was a loan, and it was called an EIDL grant. So in the second round of PPP, they had to clean that up, and all of a sudden, this became a grant again. So read the fine print, know what you're getting into. I mean, I think the restricted nature of these grants, in 90% of the cases, you've got to make sure that if you get a grant for something, which, we could have a whole nother discussion about grant writers and the difficulty it is to get a grant. But if you're getting a grant, you better be sure that you can perform the functions of that grant and that you can fund that program. If it's a reimbursing, like Lisa said, that you have the money up front, to fund these things, because at the end of the day, no nonprofit that I know of wants to have to give grant money back.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, and probably our listeners now are like, that sounds like great, but where do I find somebody, or where do I find information on how to determine this? And I would say you got a couple options. If you have an auditor, that's probably the best place to start, because your auditor doesn't believe, contrary to popular belief, they don't want to give you a finding. And a 5-minute phone call to them to have them review a grant document on and kind of give you their take on treatment of it is probably 5 minutes well spent, as opposed to just marching forward with something that's wrong and bite you come audit time. And so the other thing is really be on the lookout for keywords and get good at reading grants yourself, and those kind of trigger words, or those, I guess, power words, or whatever you want to call them, like matching funds. All of a sudden you got to come up with matching funds, or restricted for, or if you're a subcontractor, if that box is checked, like those should raise some eyebrows as well, because you're then being held to a higher standard, and those are federal funds. If you see 2 numbers with a dot and then 3 numbers after it on your grants, that's federal money. That's a CFDA number that, denotes where it's coming from. So just be aware of these things and know that there's help out there. Your auditor would probably be your first line of defense. Your accountant, of course, in-house should know this stuff. And if they don't, they need training behind it, because it can really come back to bite you if you don't.
So I want to just kind of end this segment with some interesting numbers, some interesting statistics that I found on grants. So this was talking about the percentages of grants that are funded based on the size of the grantors. And so if a grantor had received less than 50 proposals for a specific grant, 38% of them funded at least half of the proposals. So if you're going for a grant, you might not be the only one getting it. There might be quite a number of people. And if you had somebody who received 1,000 or more proposals, only 11% of those funded more than 50%. So basically what this is saying is that if you're only applying to the largest, most well-known foundations, you can expect a lower success rate than if you're seeking out grants and you're seeking out ways to find grant money from smaller organizations, smaller foundations that are willing to give out money, but might not even have that many people applying to them. One other statistic I'll end on is that if you have a foundation that is giving less than $1 million, they give away a larger share of their grant revenue than somebody who's giving $10 million or more. So keep that in mind, and don't always just apply to the largest grant holders out there. And with that, I think in the immortal words of Eddie Grant, we should rock down to Electric Avenue.
I want to know how much research you did for these grant names.
Hey, thanks for joining us for another episode of Profitless on Purpose. We really appreciate your time. For just a few accountants getting together to talk about accounting issues in the world of nonprofits. Be sure to like us and subscribe. Give us 5 stars on the whatever podcast app you're using. And if you want to comment in the YouTube video, we'll be happy to talk about it perhaps next week. We appreciate the community engagement, and we'd love to grow this show. Have a good afternoon and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks, everybody.